The UN Secretary General Guterres stated after a release of a report on November 14th that the 28th United Nations Climate Change Conference must be the place to urgently bridge the climate ambition gap. What is the most critical issue in that gap?
The most critical issue is actually around fossil fuels. We've got to really speed up the phase out of fossil fuels. There's going to be a lot of talk about that at this COP. Obviously, it's a big issue. It's being held in the UAE. That's an oil-producing country, so it's been quite controversial. But we've got to go much, much faster. And this has been a real sticking point in the last few years where, towards the end of the negotiation, and some of the language has been watered down. We need to get a really clear plan of how the world gets off fossil fuels and how we speed up the rollout of renewable energy. They'll talk about a goal at this COP. I think there will be a negotiated outcome to triple renewable energy by 2030, to double energy efficiency. That's great, but there's a lot of political barriers to doing that. So what we need to see is countries really putting the plans in place to deliver on that. So the International Energy Agency last year said that solar is now the cheapest form of energy in history. And when we work, Climate Group runs something called RE100, which is a collection of 400 global companies that are all committed to 100% renewable electricity. And we talked about what are the barriers to you just getting to 100% now. Actually, cost isn't the big issue. The big issue is the rollout of renewables on the grid in different countries. And that's prevented for a number of reasons, whether it's political, a lot of things around, permitting, who can put what renewable energy where, the amount of time that it takes to build a wind farm in somewhere like the UK, you're looking at 10 years, but actually only 2 of that is construction. 8 of it is the, permit process and the regulation, getting the permission to build. So that's the sort of thing that we need to cut down. I think the other thing is that there's a lot of subsidies that are still going into fossil fuels, and it's just not a level playing field for renewables. Everyone sort of, raises the alarm when renewables are subsidized. They should compete on the market, but fossil fuels are hugely subsidized. So we'd like to see a level playing field for renewables and fossil fuels, and then you'll really see the balance start to tip. It's really happening across the world. We see how much solar has rolled out in the last few years. So I think that trajectory is now unstoppable, but it could go faster with that political will to remove some of those sort of quite technical regulatory barriers that we see around the world.
Do you think those political barriers being torn down somewhat by the warming relationships between China and United States? And specifically in their Sunnyland statement, they said that they want to help to triple the renewable energy capacity globally by 2030, and they want to help to accelerate the substitution for coal, oil, and gas generation. And they also launched the working group on enhancing climate action in the 2020s. So how substantial is that? Will that impact on this conference?
Look, I think it's really good news to see China and the USA talking to each other again on these issues. It was absolutely critical that agreement between China and the US led to the Paris Agreement in 2015. Together, the US and China account for 40% of emissions. So it's clear we don't get anywhere on climate unless the US and China are working together and really making those commitments. So I think this is really good news. Again, we need to get from those commitments into action. I think we've seen a lot from China. China has built more and more into its domestic plans. We've seen a lot of investment in the last few years into electric vehicles. That's critical, and I think a lot of the innovation will sit with the US and China that we need. So I think it's really positive to see the two countries, whatever other disagreements there are, working together on climate.